The very well-known Diablo 4 creator Wudi has just finished interviewing PoE 2's game director Jonathan Rogers. It was a great interview. Wudi was his usual calm and friendly self. There were some juicy new bits of information and a couple of spicy takes, so we are here with the TLDR highlights. Let's get into it. It's confirmed that there are new pinnacle bosses coming to the game and they will have their own full storyline ready for release. Throughout the beta, Jonathan said there will be regular content updates with new league content coming to the game, as well as likely more than 2 economy resets, referring to these almost like mini beta leagues. Before the beta, there is going to be an internal alpha test for elite players, expect Ben, Khan, Jung Roan and the like, to test the game rigorously and try and get as much broken stuff fixed. As a nice sentiment, Jonathan said it's going to be incredibly exciting to see lots and lots of new players coming into the project and playing the game that they've been working on in a silo for so long.
And it'll be nice to be working on a game again that has players that you can kind of like talk to them in game and like do all that sort of stuff. Like that's a fun sort of time that I haven't got to have for a little while now.
They want to stick to their current content cycle of 4 3-monthly leagues with a larger endgame expansion coming in the 4th league in December. And finally, on the content side, Jonathan said that they're incredibly excited as a team to see all of the developers get back onto a live service game and see how much content they can push out with all of the new expansions.
PoE 1 hasn't had the whole giant team of PoE 2 developers, working for it and making content for it this whole time. And so then once we actually have PoE 2, there's going to just be a lot more developers working on the live shipping game. So that's going to be, there'll be a lot of content due to that reason.
Right, on the trade front, let's start with a very important question that was on people's minds. Will we definitely be able to still trade like we used to, as well as the new instant buyout system that was brought up in Ziz's interview? And Jonathan confirmed yes, that will be the case. You'll be able to direct trade as well as use the buyout system. As Jonathan and Wudi were talking, Jonathan said that it's important to him that trading in the game feels realistic and that of course you could hand an item to another player because that's what you could do in any world, as well saying that it feels appropriate that you could give gold to a trader and that they could then trade your item for you as you could in the real world. A new exciting unknown thing is what they're going to be doing with currency. So before they said that they didn't want it to cost very much gold to trade currencies because it already had its own sync. Now he's taken that one step further and said that there may actually be an in-game system potentially for trading currencies and bulk trading currencies.
Currency versus non-currency probably needs to be a little bit different. In particular for currency, I don't want you to have to go to a website to do that. You should be able to just do currency straight in-game without having to do anything. Because once again, there's not like some big search interface you need for currency, right? You just pick what currency item you want.
Finally, Jonathan said that he has softened slightly on the potential idea of SSF getting its own magic find bonus, but that would ultimately mean that they would not be able to transfer over to trade, and generally he still feels that he's not in favour of this system. Alright, so we did get lots of news about quality of life changes. Discussing things like auto pickup, Jonathan said that gold is of course auto pickup and they made that decision, but that most of the issues around picking up item and item friction should be solved or at least alleviated slightly by the fact that the item drops are going to be so much better and so fewer. A little behind the scenes thing Jonathan shared.
Okay, so the tab affinity system, that was about as far as I was able to push Chris as far as auto stashing is concerned. Like he's very much in the camp of that, of like not wanting to make it too easy.
When Wudi asked about the topic of loot filters in game, Jonathan said that generally he feels that the community and specifically Neversink have done a better job than they could with Filterblade, a new player base. Jonathan did take his point on this. The conversation then shifted over to things like the wiki, for example, and Wudi said that it feels a bit immersion breaking having to leave the game to go to these third-party tools for things that he feels should be inside the game. After quite a bit of back and forth, they did get on the same page, I think, and Jonathan did say that the way that Baldur's Gate 3 do tooltip information, where you can hover over a mechanic and then a tooltip will come up showing what that mechanic does and explaining it to the player, he said that this feels appropriate and important to have in the game and confirmed that they are going to have something like that in the game.
If an item mentions Ignite, you're going to be able to, there's a way to pop open a little box about what Ignite is and how it works. Like, we are going to do that.
Huge win, huge boost for new players. Wudi brought up a really interesting point about helping players understand what nearby means, and if GGG could visualize somehow for players how big the area of effect on their skill was. Jonathan actually really liked this idea and said that he'll have a conversation with the UX guy and see if it was possible. Finally, on quality of life, they have allowed players to move using WASD whilst they're interacting with the inventory. Now, this has massive massive ramifications for racing and the racing scene, but Jonathan said that he feels that the broader benefit to the main player base outweighs any concerns they have about changing up the racing meta. Okay, on to crafting. Generally speaking, Jonathan wanted to double down on the fact that the intention is for players to craft more often as they go through the game, though he was very keen to point out that the game will still support those high-end crafting projects. They reiterated that the design philosophy around the league-specific crafting options will be targeted at specific item bases to try not to overwhelm players and to try and encourage players to try out lots of different endgame content whilst they're doing their crafts. This interview made it very clear that Jonathan and the rest of the PoE2 team are holding their cards very close to their chests around the crafting bench. I have no idea why this is, and the mystery around it is just making my mind think that there's going to be a big change there or something, but I don't want to get too ahead of myself. Maybe they're just not ready to share exactly what they want to do with it. And the final thing that actually came up in Wudi's chat is the way that essences are likely to change. Of course, with no re-rolling currencies that completely re-roll an item happening in the game, then essences are going to be very different. We've actually got an idea for this alongside a full Delve 2.0 League content theory crafting video that I'm working on, potentially with a special guest, so subscribe to the channel to see when that drops. Alright, this is where the conversation actually got really interesting and was kind of unique to Wudi's position as a D4 content creator. Wudi asked what other games are there that have inspired Jonathan and the team in the development of Path of Exile 2.
In general, I would say I try to take more inspiration from non-action RPGs because I find that to be a more interesting thing. What I think that the action RPGs do, they set a floor for what is a minimum acceptable level of functionality, I guess.
Just how he very openly shared that Last Epoch has changed the game with the way that trade is done in action RPGs, and that they needed to evolve and adapt to meet that. He then used a very fancy word that I will not try and say and made a very interesting point here.
Sometimes you'll see situations of covariant evolution. We'll be in a design session and we'll be like, oh, we could do this thing. And then somebody will go, oh, but this other game does that. And I'm always kind of like, well, okay, but we can't let the fact another game did this be a reason to not do it. You know what I mean? Like sometimes you get that situation where people want to be different than their competitors just for the sake of being different. And I think that's also a trap. If something is good for our game, then we should do it regardless of whether a competitor does it or not.
This is where it then started to get a little bit interesting and spicy, but in a very friendly and earnest way. Wudi asked if the GGG team had to make PoE2 because they knew the Diablo 4 was coming out. Jonathan responded very openly and frankly, as we're becoming accustomed to, saying that the real reason was that PoE1 was hitting a ceiling in terms of their player base.
And like, this is going to sound extremely mercenary, but like, you know, we look at our curve of players and like, the rate of increase started to decline, if you know what I mean.
And they realised that if they were going to break through this ceiling, then they had to somehow bring Path of Exile into a new generation of action RPGs, making it a AAA experience from the very start of the campaign. Wudi then, interestingly and rightly so for his audience, asked how PoE2 compares to D4 in Jonathan's eyes. His responses were brilliant.
For me, the big difference is in the way the combat feels. I mean, look, there are other things as well. I mean, there's like to do with, I mean, I feel like we're more willing to embrace complexity in certain ways and things like that. Maybe people from the D4 team would disagree with this a little bit, but I think that we've got a more of a, like live service type route as far as like we know how to maintain a game in the long term quite well, I think.
I mean, as a Path of Exile player, I had to laugh hearing that. And he's right. I mean, it's a bit of a zinger, but they've been doing this for 10, 11 years now, and they've been doing it successfully. Season after season, league after league. Okay, next up we got some nice bits of information about skill and build design, some confirmations and some changes. Jonathan said that broadly co-op will be a lot different because the skill interactions that affect solo gameplay will also affect group gameplay. The example he gave here was of a warrior and a druid duo party, and the druid setting up the volcano skill and then both the warrior and the druid being able to use slams to cause that volcano to erupt with molten balls. It's amazing to think of all of the myriad combinations that could come out of having these skill interactions now work between your party. After this, the guys got discussing power creep, and Jonathan said that broadly, most people in the studio at GGG aren't particularly happy with how the power creep has ramped up over the last 3 to 4 years over on Path of Exile 1, but he feels confident that with PoE 2 they're going to be able to keep that power creep at bay for a long time, and that he believes there is a solution for this out there. Okay, so this is probably the biggest thing that was confirmed and discussed within this interview, and that is the controversial topic of respecking. Jonathan said that since the Zizaran interview, they've continued to discuss this as a team, and they've now decided to go in a very different direction with how players will respec their characters.
So the current respec system actually uses gold. So basically, it's cheaper at low levels and more expensive at high levels, and there you go. So yeah,
wow,
that's what we decided to change it, and that's where we ended up.
The gold cost to respec your character early on in the game will be a lot cheaper, and it will become more and more expensive as you level up through the game. I think this alleviates so many people's worries and issues, and it actually really helps new players coming into the game and solves that problem that's kept coming up time and time again in these discussions. It's another example of how GGG are willing to change things quite fundamentally and honour the player base over maybe what they'd originally thought as their core design intentions. Though knowing GGG, this will not be trivial to achieve later on in the game, and I expect that their philosophy of wanting players to really feel connected and grounded in their character as they go through the game will remain true. So the future of Orbs of Regret are very much up in the air, and are probably going to go the way of the Orb of Alteration and get the can. Alright, so finishing up here, let's get into a few quick fire bits of miscellaneous information that also came up. They are not afraid to make drastic, sweeping, build-breaking changes throughout the beta period, and that is what it's for. Ultra-wide support has been confirmed. We got an update on the progress of the Witch Showcase. Jonathan said that as they were preparing it and getting it ready, they just felt there was a little bit more they could do, and they wanted to go back to the drawing board on a couple of things, improve things, and that they will have it very soon for us. Wudi and Jonathan generally talked about how melee is going to feel so much better in PoE 2, and that the divide between melee and ranged, and the advantage that ranged inherently has, is going to be much, much narrower. Another change that was discussed was the way that crit and crit scaling work in PoE 2. Now, Jonathan said that Rory was probably the best person to talk about this, and that he didn't want to discuss it too much, but that broadly speaking, stats on items and passive tree points are all being reworked to make crit feel slightly different. Jonathan let us know that there will definitely be ways to alter dodge roll, and that most of these will come from Spirit Reservation, but there will also be uniques which change this. Now, my mind, I'm sure, just like yours, goes to things like teleportation or phasing, if there's a way to dash or jump, or even, something crazy like being able to bury under the ground. Any of these things are possible, super interesting, and I can't wait to see more on that. So one thing Jonathan reiterated that he would love to achieve is getting more in-game and officially supported racing and race seasons happening. The success of the Gauntlet, I think, within the community, I'm sure some of you guys have been watching, has been incredible, and huge congratulations to Ben. I saw his Uber Elder defeat earlier. Also, rest in peace, Rise. Sorry, mate, I've just seen that as well on my news feed. Wudi and Jonathan discussed some nice to haves would be things like guild improvements, as well as potentially like a mentor system where you could flag up you were open to showing new players through the game. It's an interesting idea. Jonathan said he hadn't thought about it, and hey, maybe something like that could be good. And a final, still huge question mark, unknown, is cross-platform. I think it's something they clearly would want to make work. It's huge for business. It would be brilliant, but there's just tons and tons of certifications. And I mentioned this in a previous video, but my housemate actually works for a games company, and they've released their game across many, many platforms now. And he said it's such a pain in the arse to manage and to get all of the clearances and the certifications right, and the delays and how it messes with the pipeline. So huge question marks around that one. Very, very hopeful that it will happen, because of course, like many of you, I've got friends and family that all play on different consoles, and it'd just be wicked to bring them into PoE and not have it so PC centric if possible. Right guys, that is the TLDR. That is everything that I picked up and made note of from the conversation. I hope you've enjoyed this. Of course, go over to Wudi's channel, watch the whole thing. I've linked it in the description below. And what are your thoughts on some of the changes? I'm personally so happy to hear about the respecking change. Not even for me, because like many of you, we've played the game a long time and we kind of know what we're doing about our build and we already have it mapped out. But I just think for so many new players that are going to come into the game, that early on, say like pre-level 30, 40 ability to just like fairly easily pay to respec your character, I think that's just going to be such an important change. Anyway, that's my thoughts. Would love to hear yours, and I will look forward to seeing you in the next one. Friends, Exiles, ta-da.